Vivian Moreau picked up her wine glass, turned to face the man in the worn jacket across the room, and said loud enough for 2 tables to hear, "Someone should tell him this restaurant has a dress code." Her friends laughed. The man didn't react. He just cut his daughter's duck in half and slid the better piece onto her plate. That was the moment Vivian made her mistake, because she looked at a man in an old blazer and saw nothing worth knowing. She had no idea she was sitting 10 feet away from someone who spoke 5 languages, including the one she just used to humiliate him. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it before part 2, because what happens next in that restaurant will change the way you see people forever. The morning it all began, Daniel Hayes burned his daughter's toast. Not badly, just enough that Emma wrinkled her nose when she walked into the kitchen and said, "Dad, it smells like the garage in here." "It's artisanal," Daniel said without turning around. "Very expensive restaurants serve it this way." Emma climbed onto the bar stool at their small kitchen counter and rested her chin in both hands, watching him scrape the black edges into the sink. "Do they really?" "No." He set the plate in front of her. "But it sounds better than I got distracted." She laughed. That laugh, open and unguarded, the kind only 9-year-olds still have, hit Daniel somewhere behind the sternum the way it always did. Like a reminder, like a reason. He poured her orange juice and watched her eat, the morning light coming in sideways through the kitchen window, landing on the side of her face. She looked so much like her mother sometimes that it still caught him off guard, even after all these years. The same dark eyes. The same way she tilted her head when she was thinking about something she wasn't sure she should say out loud. "Dad," Emma said in that exact tone. "Yeah. My birthday's in 3 weeks. I'm aware. And I've been thinking." She pushed a piece of toast around her plate. "I don't need a big present, like not a toy or anything." Daniel leaned back against the counter and crossed his arms. This was already a setup. He could feel it. "Okay. I've just been thinking," she said again, still not looking at him, "about what it would feel like to eat at a really nice restaurant. Like the kind where they have candles on the tables, and waiters who wear vests, and the menus don't have pictures on them." He looked at her. "Menus don't have pictures. That's how you know it's fancy. Maggie at school told me. She said her mom went to one, and the menu was just words and everything cost more than $100, and they served the water with ice cubes shaped like spheres." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Sphere ice cubes. He thought about his bank account. He thought about the carburetor job he'd been putting off quoting because he already knew the customer couldn't afford the honest price. He thought about the winter jacket he'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. He thought about his daughter's face right now, that careful, hopeful, trying not to ask too much expression that she'd learned too early for a 9-year-old. "Okay," he said. Emma looked up. "Okay, what?" "Okay, we'll go." She stared at him. "For real?" "For your birthday. Yeah, somewhere with the sphere ice." The way Emma's face changed in that moment, Daniel stored it. He filed it away in the place where he kept the things he was going to carry forever. The look of a child who had asked for something small because she'd already decided not to ask for something big, and then found out she could have both. She got off the bar stool and hugged him hard around the middle, her face pressed against his chest, and said something muffled that he couldn't quite make out. "What?" She looked up. "I said you're the best dad in the whole world." "The whole world. The whole entire world." He put his hand on the top of her head. "That's a lot of competition." "You're still winning," she said, and went to grab her backpack for school. Daniel stood in the kitchen after she left, listening to the sound of the front door closing, and did the math. 3 weeks. He could do it. He was going to have to do it quietly. Daniel Hayes had learned a long time ago how to make a little go a long way. He'd learned it the first time in Haiti, 3 days after the earthquake, when the relief team he was coordinating had 40 liters of clean water and a need for 400. He'd learned it again in a flooded village outside Dhaka, where 6 volunteers were supposed to cover 40 square miles of damage assessment. He'd learned it in a tent hospital in South Sudan, and a displacement camp in Turkey, and a dozen other places that didn't make international news for more than a week before the cameras moved on. He knew how to stretch. He knew how to prioritize. He knew what actually mattered and what just felt like it mattered. What mattered right now was Emma's birthday dinner. So for the next 3 weeks, Daniel Hayes quietly restructured his life. He started packing his own lunch instead of grabbing a sandwich from the place down the block. He skipped his twice-a-week coffee from the cart outside the shop. He quoted the carburetor job at a number that would actually cover his cost instead of discounting it out of guilt. He picked up a Saturday morning shift for a colleague who needed a weekend off. He did all of it without telling Emma, not because he was ashamed, but because he wanted the night to feel like something that had always been possible, not like something that required sacrifice. Emma already knew too much about sacrifice. She had figured out somewhere around age 7 that the reason they didn't take vacations was because money was tight. She had never once complained about it. That was the part that broke his heart a little. The not complaining. Kids shouldn't learn to not complain that early. His coworker at the shop, a big loud man named Terry, who had been fixing transmissions for 25 years and had strong opinions about everything, noticed Daniel eating a homemade sandwich for the 4th day in a row. "You on some kind of diet?" Terry asked. "No." "You trying to save money?" "Mind your business, Terry." Terry pointed a wrench at him. "You're taking that little girl somewhere nice for her birthday, aren't you?" Daniel said nothing. "I knew it," Terry said, looking deeply satisfied. "You're a soft touch, Hayes. You know that I prefer to think of it as financially motivated emotional intelligence. That's the most complicated way I've ever heard someone say they're a pushover." But he was smiling when he said it. And the following Friday, Terry set an envelope on Daniel's workbench without a word, then walked to the other side of the shop and made a lot of unnecessary noise about something that needed tightening. Daniel opened the envelope. Inside was $200 in 20s and a post-it note that said, "Don't make it weird." He stared at it for a long moment. Then he put it in his pocket. He did not make it weird. He just quietly added it to the fund. By the time Emma's birthday arrived, he had enough for one dinner at Ardoise, the kind of French-American restaurant that existed in the pages of magazines Daniel had never expected to set foot inside. He'd researched it carefully. 3 weeks of reading reviews, studying the menu online, figuring out what to order, how the evening would flow, what to wear. He owned one blazer. He'd bought it 5 years ago for a parent-teacher conference that turned out to be more formal than expected. It still fit. Mostly. He laid it out on the bed the afternoon of Emma's birthday and looked at it. It wasn't new. It wasn't expensive. The lining was starting to separate at one shoulder seam, but only if you lifted your arm a certain way. He pressed it, hung it back up, and went to get Emma ready for the night she'd been imagining. Ardoise was the kind of place that made you feel its judgment the moment you stepped through the door. Not loudly, not obviously, just in the way the maitre d' looked at you for a half-second too long before his professional smile clicked into place. In the way the lighting was calibrated to make crystal look more expensive and working men's blazers look more worn. In the low register of conversation that suggested everyone present already knew something you didn't. Daniel felt all of it. He'd felt versions of it before, in government offices, in underfunded cities, in UN coordination rooms, where certain people looked through field workers rather than at them, and he knew exactly what it was. He just let it land and kept moving. Emma, walking beside him with her hand in his, was not feeling any of it. She was looking at the chandeliers. "Dad?" she whispered, eyes tracking slowly across the ceiling. "They're like frozen fireworks." "Yeah," he said. "Kind of. Do you think they ever fall? They're bolted in." "But what if—" "Emma." "Right, okay." She squeezed his hand and looked back down. "It's so quiet in here. Why is everyone talking so quiet?" "Because the tables are close together and they're pretending they're not." She thought about this. "That's weird." Extremely. The maitre d' led them to their table. It was not a bad table, not a great one either. Not the way the placement in restaurants like this was a language of its own, but it was fine. It had the candle Emma had asked for. It had cloth napkins. A waiter in a vest appeared within 30 seconds and presented them with menus. No pictures. Emma saw this immediately and turned to Daniel with an expression of absolute vindication. "I told you," she whispered. "You did." Maggie was right. Maggie clearly has inside information. The waiter, young maybe 28 with the slightly harried look of someone working a Friday double shift, introduced himself as Lucas. He recited the specials with practiced ease and told them to take their time. Emma opened the menu and stared at it. Daniel watched her. She was quiet for a long moment reading. Her lips moved slightly on a few of the French words. He could see the exact moment she decided she didn't want to ask what something was and embarrass herself, and the exact moment she decided she didn't care. "Dad," she said, "what's duck confit?" "Duck that's been cooked slowly in its own fat, then usually crisped up in a pan. It's very good." She made a face. "Cooked in its own fat." "I know how it sounds." "That sounds..." She stopped. "Actually, does it taste good? It tastes like the best version of a thing you didn't know you were missing." She looked back at the menu. "Okay, I want to try the duck confit." He ordered the duck confit for her. For himself, he ordered the cheapest entree on the menu, a roasted chicken that cost more than he usually spent on groceries for 3 days, and told himself that was fine. That tonight was for Emma, not for him. And for about 45 minutes, it was exactly that. Emma ate 3 pieces of the breadbasket. She tried the sparkling water and wrinkled her nose at the bubbles. She pointed very discreetly at a man across the room whose tie had a pattern of tiny sailing boats on it, and whispered, "Dad, do you think he knows?" She decided after 3 bites that duck confit was in fact the best version of something she hadn't known she was missing. Daniel watched all of it. He was not thinking about much. Just this. Just Emma, and the candle, and the frozen firework chandeliers, and the way the sphere ice melted slowly in her glass of water. He was thinking that he had done something right. He did not yet know that across the room someone was already deciding something about him. Vivienne Moreau had not chosen Ardoise by accident. She chose it because the head chef had just been featured in 3 major publications, because 2 of her most important European investors had expressed interest in meeting here specifically, and because Vivienne Moreau did not make small choices. Every room she entered was a decision. Every table she chose was a statement. She was 42 years old, the founder and CEO of Maison Moreau, a global luxury lifestyle company that operated in 31 countries. She spoke 4 languages. She had been featured on the covers of 7 different business magazines in the last decade. She owned a penthouse in New York, a house in Bordeaux, and a flat in Milan. She had earned all of it. That part was real. What had grown up alongside the earning quieter, slower, easier to miss, was the distance. Not the physical distance of travel, though there was plenty of that. It was the other kind. The kind that develops when every room you walk into rearranges itself around your presence. When assistants anticipate your needs before you voice them. When the last time someone genuinely disagreed with you out loud was so long ago, you've stopped expecting it to happen. The distance that makes you stop seeing some people as fully people. Vivienne didn't think of herself as arrogant. Arrogance in her mind was loud and crude, the province of men who needed to announce themselves. What she had, she would have said, was standards, an eye for quality, an understanding of the difference between people who operated at a high level and people who didn't. She noticed Daniel and Emma when they were led to their table, not because she was looking for them, just because she noticed everything. It was a professional habit, the constant environmental scan. She took in the blazer. The way it fit not badly, but not well. The slight wear at the collar. The way Daniel sat down and then looked around the room in a way that wasn't rude, but that was unmistakably the look of someone orienting themselves in unfamiliar territory. She leaned toward the man on her left, a venture capital executive named Philippe, who had flown in from Paris and who shared her particular appreciation for a certain kind of humor. "Look at table 9, she said very quietly in French. Philippe glanced. I'm trying to figure out if he lost a bet or if someone told him this restaurant has a different dress code on Fridays. Philippe smiled into his wine glass. Perhaps he's here for a very important meeting with his daughter Darling. She picked up her own wine glass. You can always tell. The way he looked at the menu like he was reading a document in a foreign language. He might be out of his element. He is absolutely out of his element. She said it not unkindly, or at least she didn't think of it as unkind. It was simply observation. It was simply true. She returned to her conversation, but she kept Daniel Hayes in her peripheral vision. When the sommelier arrived at Vivian's table, she took the wine list without opening it. "The Domaine de la Romanée Conti," she said in crisp, confident French. "The 2015 if you have it. If not, the 2013. She handed the list back. "And tell Chef Beaumont that if the turbot tonight is as good as the last time I was here, I'll be mentioning it in the piece I'm doing for Lux Europe next month." The sommelier nodded, visibly pleased, and stepped away. Vivian's table 6 people, a mix of European investors and American executives she was courting for a new joint venture, had all heard. That was the point. Not the wine itself, which was extraordinary and which she genuinely enjoyed, but the fluency with which she'd ordered it. The easy cultural authority. The reminder dropped so naturally, it barely felt like a reminder of exactly who she was. She caught Philippe's eye. He raised his glass slightly. Then she looked at Daniel's table. He had just quietly corrected Emma on something she couldn't hear what, and Emma had laughed and punched his arm lightly, and he'd caught her hand and held it for a second, still smiling the way parents do when the kid is funny and affectionate, and you're so in love with them, you don't know what to do with it. Vivian watched this for just a moment. Then she said in French to the table, "There's something almost charming about watching people eat out of their price range, like they've watched enough movies to know the moves but not the music." 2 people at her table laughed. 1 didn't. Emma Hayes across the room couldn't hear the words. But she was 9, and 9-year-olds are attuned to attention the way animals are attuned to weather. She felt someone looking. She leaned toward her father. "Dad?" she said quietly. "That lady keeps looking at us." Daniel didn't turn. "People look." She said something, in the other language, and her friends laughed. He was quiet for a moment. "Dad," Emma said, "was it about us?" He looked at her then, calm, unhurried. The way he'd learned to be calm in places where calm was the most useful thing you could offer. "Emma," he said, "what's the rule about what other people think of us?" She thought about it. "It doesn't define us." "Right, but it still feels bad," she said quietly, like she was admitting something she wasn't sure was allowed. "Yeah," he said. "Sometimes it does. That's okay. Feeling bad about something doesn't mean you were wrong." She nodded slowly. "Eat your duck," he said. "Tell me if it's still the best thing you've ever had." She looked at her plate. "It's still top 5. That's significant." She smiled and he smiled, and across the room, Vivian Moreau refilled her wine glass and said something that made Philippe lean back and laugh, and the restaurant kept moving around, all of them, indifferent and glittering and loud, in the way that expensive places were always loud, full of noise that dressed itself up as silence. It started with a mistake. That's how these things usually start. Not with a villain's plan or a clean inciting incident. Just with a young man carrying the wrong bottle of wine. Lucas. The waiter, 28, working a double 3 tables over capacity on a Friday night, had been moving fast all evening. He was good at his job the way people are good at things when they've done them under pressure enough times that the pressure starts to feel like their natural state. But he was tired, and someone in the kitchen had pulled the wrong vintage from the cellar, and he'd been handed the bottle without checking the label carefully, because he was already holding 2 dessert plates with his other arm. He presented the bottle to Vivian's table. Vivian glanced at the label. She did not say anything immediately. She let the silence stretch a long, deliberate pause that Lucas felt settle over him like a weight. He looked at the label. He saw what he'd done. "I'm so sorry," he said immediately. "I'll take this back and—" "Where did you find this?" Vivian said in French. Lucas spoke some French. Not enough. I apologize, This is the 2009. She said it the way you say something that you want everyone at the table to hear. I asked for the 2015 or the 2013. Did you not hear me, or did you simply not understand what I was asking? I'm very sorry, it was a mistake at the cellar. I'll correct it immediately. And your pronunciation of the wine name, by the way, was quite poor. If you're going to work in a restaurant of this level, perhaps you should learn to say the names of what you're serving. The table had gone quiet. Not just Vivian's table. The tables close enough to hear. Lucas stood there, 28 years old, doing his best, tired and humiliated and caught in the particular kind of public embarrassment that has nowhere to go. You can't defend yourself. You can't leave. You can't make it stop. You just have to stand there and absorb it and wait for it to end. His jaw was tight. His hands holding the bottle were very still. Daniel saw his face. He'd seen that face before. Not this exact face, not this exact room, but the expression, the particular combination of shame and helplessness, and the effort not to show either. He had seen that on faces in a lot of different places and a lot of different circumstances. He knew what it was. He knew exactly what it was. He set his fork down. "Dad," Emma said. He stood up. Not fast, not with the energy of someone spoiling for something, just the simple, quiet rising of a man who has decided to go somewhere. "I'll be right back," he said. "Where are you?" "1 minute." He crossed the restaurant. He didn't know yet exactly what he was going to do. He knew he was going to do something. He knew he wasn't going to stand in his seat and watch a 28-year-old waiter get flayed in public on a Friday night in front of a room full of people who were all very carefully pretending to look elsewhere. He reached the table. He stood just to the side of Lucas, close enough to be part of the situation, but not in front of it, a small thing, but deliberate. He didn't want to take over. He wanted to even something out. "Excuse me," he said. He said it in English first. Vivian looked at him. He saw the calculation happen in her eyes. The split-second resorting of who she thought she was dealing with. The slight lift of her chin. "I think there may have been a miscommunication about the order," Daniel said. "I happened to hear, and I think I can help sort it out." "I don't believe I need help from," she began, and she said it in the way that the end of the sentence was obvious without being spoken. Daniel had heard sentences end like that before. He turned to Lucas and he spoke in French. Not practiced French. Not the French of a man who has memorized useful phrases. The French of someone who has lived inside the language, who has argued in it and laughed in it and tried to comfort strangers in it at 3 a.m. when everything had gone wrong. He said, "The 2015 Romanée Conti. They should have it. The cellar logs from last month's inventory showed 8 bottles remaining. If they've moved stock, check if there's a 2013 Burgundy from the same producer. She'll find it acceptable." Lucas stared at him. He responded in French almost reflexively. Yes, I think we have the 2013. I can check immediately." "Go," Daniel said gently. "It's fine." Lucas left. Daniel turned back. Vivian Moreau was looking at him. The confident smile from before, the one that had been doing all the conversational work at her table all evening, was not at this moment operating at full capacity. "You speak French," she said. It wasn't really a question. "Yes," Daniel said. She recovered quickly. She was good at recovering quickly. "Impressive," she said. And the word was a small, precise weapon, a compliment that was really a diminishment. Impressive, like he'd performed a trick. Like he'd recited something she hadn't expected from a man in an old blazer. "Did you study abroad? Some kind of program?" "No," he said. "I lived there." "For how long?" "Off and on. About 2 years overall, between different assignments." "Assignments?" She smiled slightly. "What kind of assignments?" And here was the moment Daniel felt it the way you feel. A room shift where someone was offering him an opportunity to explain himself, to justify his presence, to prove to her satisfaction that he deserved to be standing at her table. He didn't take it. Instead, he looked at her with an expression that was not hostile and not deferential, just clear and a little tired and absolutely steady, and he said simply, "The kind that needed to be done." She was quiet for exactly 1 beat, and then because she was good at her job and composure was a tool she'd spent decades sharpening, she smiled. But it was not quite the same smile as before. "Well," she said, "thank you for the intervention." He nodded. He turned to go back to his table, and then Philippe, who had been watching all of this with a kind of delighted attention, the way certain people watch things when they sense something interesting is happening, said in Italian to the man beside him, "I wonder if he only speaks the one." Not loudly, not to Daniel. A side comment. The kind that's technically not aimed at anyone but is absolutely designed to land. Daniel heard it. He stopped. He turned back. He looked at Philippe, and he answered in Italian without any particular heat, the way you might correct a small factual error in an otherwise reasonable conversation. "No," he said. "Not only the one." The table went very still. Philippe looked at him. Daniel continued in Italian, easy and unhurried. "The 2013 Burgundy she'll be brought is actually the more interesting bottle in my opinion. The 2015 gets more attention, but the 13 has more to say if you give it room." He paused. Then in Spanish, turning slightly, as if simply including another part of the room in the same conversation. "Wine is like most things worth paying attention to. The quieter ones often have more going on than the ones that announce themselves." One of Vivian's guests, a woman who had been introduced as the head of a Madrid-based investment group, made a small involuntary sound. Not quite a laugh, more like the sound of recognition. Daniel moved to German. "My daughter is 9 years old, and she ordered the duck confit without knowing what it was, purely on faith that something new might surprise her. That's the better philosophy, I think." The German investor at the table, a man in his 60s, who had not smiled once all evening, smiled. And then, because the room was completely silent now, because every conversation at every nearby table had wound down without anyone quite deciding to stop it, Daniel looked directly at Vivian Moreau and spoke in Mandarin. "The most useful thing I ever learned was that how you treat the person serving you says more about you than anything you could order." The Mandarin was not accented in the way that American Mandarin usually was. It carried the particular texture of someone who had learned it in the places where it was spoken in markets and hospitals and coordination centers and long conversations with people who were patiently correcting his tones. Vivian's assistant, a young Chinese-American woman named May, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table all evening, essentially invisible, looked up. She looked at Daniel, and then she looked at Vivian. Finally, Daniel returned to English. Calm. No theater, just the end of a thing. "I hope you enjoy the 2013, he said, "and I hope the rest of your evening is good. Lucas is a hard-working kid. He didn't deserve what just happened." He walked back to his table. The restaurant was so quiet that the sound of his shoes on the floor was audible. He sat down. Emma was staring at him with an expression he'd never seen from her before, not exactly anyway. It was something between pride and wonder, and the particular kind of awe that children feel when they realize that someone they already loved completely is also somehow more than they knew. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. How many languages was that?" He picked up his fork. "5. 5, she repeated. "Approximately." "You didn't tell me you knew 5 languages." "You didn't ask." She processed this. "What did you say? In all the different ones?" He looked at her. He thought about how to answer. Then he said, "I said that the things that look the most impressive aren't always the most important, and the people that look the least impressive sometimes have the most to say." Emma thought about this for a moment. Did she understand? Daniel looked briefly across the room. Vivian Moreau was sitting very straight. She was not talking. Her wine glass was in her hand, but she wasn't drinking from it. She was looking at the table. "I don't know," he said, "but sometimes you say things because they need to be said, not because you know they'll be heard." Emma considered this too. Then, "I still think she was being mean." She was. And you still helped her. I helped Lucas. Those are different things. She nodded slowly the way she nodded when she was filing something away. The duck confit had gotten a little cold. She ate it anyway. She said it was still top 3, which Daniel thought was generous. Lucas came back with the 2013 Burgundy. He presented it to Vivian's table. He did everything correctly, properly, professionally. Before he left, he passed by Daniel's table. He stopped. He stood there for a moment. "Thank you," he said quietly. I don't know who you are, but thank you." Daniel nodded. "Don't let one person's bad night make you think less of your own." Lucas looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded and went back to work. They had dessert, a chocolate tart for Emma, which she declared absolutely completely perfect in every single way, and a coffee for Daniel, which came in a small cup with a tiny biscuit balanced on the saucer that he didn't eat, but that Emma asked for and consumed in one bite. "I want to do this every year," Emma said. "We'll see." "I know we'll see," she said. "I know what we'll see means." "Then you know more than most adults." "Dad." He smiled. She smiled. Around them the restaurant hummed and gleamed, and Daniel was aware in the way he'd been aware all evening that people were occasionally glancing at their table, but the quality of the glances had changed. They were different now. Less like the glances you give something out of place, and more like the glances you give something you're trying to understand. He didn't particularly care about either kind. He cared about Emma finishing her chocolate tart with the focused solemnity of someone consuming something they knew they would remember. When the check came, Daniel paid it. He left a tip that was more than he could comfortably afford. He left it for Lucas. As they were getting their coats, Emma took his hand and they walked toward the door. They passed Vivian Moreau's table. Daniel did not look at it. Emma did. Vivian looked up at exactly that moment. She looked at Emma. And Emma, because she was 9, and because she was Emma, and because her father had raised her on the principle that kindness was not weakness, smiled at her. Not sarcastically, not triumphantly, just a smile. A small, genuine 9-year-old smile, the kind that doesn't carry a single complicated thing inside it. Vivian Moreau looked at that smile, and something in her expression behind the composure behind the evening armor shifted. Daniel felt Emma squeeze his hand. He squeezed back. They walked out into the night. The city outside was cold and bright and indifferent in the way that New York was always indifferent. A million lives moving through the same geography without acknowledging each other. And Emma walked beside him on the sidewalk and said, "Dad, I have to ask you something." "Okay." "You knew 5 languages this whole time." "Yes." "And you work at the car shop." "Yes." "And before that you were doing the earthquake thing. Disaster relief coordination." "Yes." "So why did you stop?" He walked for a moment before answering. "I didn't stop," he said. "I changed what I was doing. There are a lot of ways to help people." "But why did you come home?" He looked down at her. "Because," he said, "the most important person in the world needed me to." Emma thought about this. Then she looked up at him, and she said with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who has just confirmed something she already believed, "I'm the most important person in the world." "That's correct," Daniel said. "Good," she said. And she leaned her head against his arm as they walked. The restaurant grew smaller behind them. The city moved around them uncaring and enormous, and full of a million things that didn't matter and a few things that did. And Daniel Hayes walked his daughter home through the November cold, her hand in his, her head on his arm, her hair smelling like the restaurant and the outside air. And he thought about all the places he had been, and all the things he had carried, and all the languages he had learned in the service of strangers. And he thought that none of it, not one word, not 1 mile, not one long night in a tent, in a place most people would never find on a map, had been wasted. Because all of it had led here. To this sidewalk. To this 9-year-old. to the fact that when the moment came when a young man was standing alone in the middle of a room full of people pretending not to watch Daniel Hayes, had known exactly what to say, and exactly how to say it in exactly the right language. 5 languages. 5 bridges. Built over years in places no luxury restaurant would ever acknowledge, for people no power list would ever name. He hadn't spoken them to impress anyone. He'd spoken them because someone needed to hear them. That was the whole story. That was all it had ever been. The silence that followed Daniel back to his table was not the comfortable kind. It was the kind of silence that happens when a room full of people have all witnessed the same thing and are now separately deciding what to do with it. Conversations that had paused started back up again, but quieter and with less certainty than before. Silverware clinked. Someone coughed. A woman near the window laughed at something her companion said, then stopped a little too quickly, like she'd forgotten where she was. At table 7, Vivian Moreau set her wineglass down. She did not pick it up again for almost 2 full minutes. Philippe, who had been the one to make the comment in Italian, the one that had opened the door to everything that followed, was now studying the dessert menu with the focused attention of a man who very much wanted to be somewhere else in his own head. The woman from Madrid, whose name was Isabel, was looking at the table in front of her with the expression of someone revising something they'd thought was settled. May, Vivian's assistant, had her eyes down, but her shoulders were different than they'd been 20 minutes ago. Straighter, less collapsed into herself. Nobody at the table spoke. Vivian was aware of all of it. She was always aware of everything in a room. It was one of the things that had made her exceptional at what she did. You couldn't build what she'd built without knowing how to read environments, read people, read the temperature of a moment before it shifted. Right now, the temperature was telling her something she did not want to hear. She reached for her wine. The 2013 Burgundy that Lucas had brought the bottle Daniel had quietly directed him toward was, she had to admit, extraordinary. Richer than she'd expected. More layered. It had something going on underneath the obvious notes that the 2015 she'd originally ordered wouldn't have had. She hated that he'd been right about that too. "Well," Philippe said, finally putting the dessert menu down. "That was unexpected." "Yes," Vivian said. 5 languages." "I heard." "And the Mandarin was Philippe." She said his name the way you'd set something heavy on a table. Final. Not angry, just done. "I heard." He stopped. Across the room, she could see Daniel Hayes helping Emma with something on her plate. The girl was talking animated, gesturing with her fork in a way that would have gotten her corrected at most of the tables in this restaurant, and Daniel wasn't correcting her. He was watching her with the particular expression of a parent who is genuinely entertained by their kid and isn't bothering to hide it. He said something back to her. She laughed and put her fork down and picked it back up. They looked like the most comfortable 2 people in the building. Vivian looked away. Isabel, the woman from Madrid, spoke carefully. "He said something in Spanish," she said. "About wine. About the quieter things having more to say." "I know what he said," Vivian replied. "It was elegant," Isabel said. "Not as a challenge, just as a fact delivered in the neutral tone of someone who deals in facts professionally." "The Spanish was elegant. Where did he learn it?" "I have no idea. He said he lived in France, off and on, assignments." "That's what he said." Isabel looked at her. "You don't know who he is?" "No." "Interesting," Isabel said, and returned to her food. That word, interesting, landed differently than it should have. It wasn't a compliment directed at Daniel. But it wasn't a compliment directed at Vivian either. It was something in between, something that sat in the space where the evening had shifted, and Vivian felt it. She was not accustomed to feeling things in spaces she didn't control. She picked up her phone under the table and typed a name. She'd had to guess at the reservation book visible from the maitre d's podium if you had the right angle, which Vivian always did. She'd clocked it when they walked in. Hayes. Party of 2. She searched the name. She found a LinkedIn profile. Small auto repair shop on the west side of Manhattan, listed as owner-operator. Before that, 5 years with a humanitarian coordination network she'd vaguely heard of. Before that, a graduate degree in international relations from a university whose name she recognized immediately because she'd once donated a building to them. Before that, undergraduate work in linguistics. She stared at the screen. Linguistics. She put the phone face down on the table. Philippe, who had been watching her, said nothing. Smart man. She picked up the burgundy and took a long drink and looked at the table and thought about a man who had a graduate degree and spoke 5 languages and had spent years in the field doing the kind of work that most people with his education chose to write about from a comfortable distance instead, and who was now repairing cars on the west side of Manhattan and bringing his daughter to dinner for her birthday in a blazer that was 4 years past its best day. She thought about what she'd said when they walked in. Someone should tell him this restaurant has a dress code. She thought about Emma's plate and the way Daniel had cut the better piece of duck and slid it across without saying a word about it. She thought about Lucas's face. She thought about what Daniel had said in Mandarin directly to her. The most useful thing I ever learned was that how you treat the person serving you says more about you than anything you could order. The burgundy was exceptional. She barely tasted it. She was still sitting with that when Lucas came to offer the dessert menu. He came to her table first, which was protocol. She was clearly the primary guest. He was completely professional, composed, no visible remnant of what had happened earlier. He presented the options, clearly answered Isabel's question about the soufflé timing, confirmed that the kitchen could do a modification for Philippe's allergy, and moved through the whole thing efficiently and without a single crack in his surface. But Vivian watched his hands while he talked. They were completely still now. 20 minutes ago, holding the wrong bottle, they had not been still. She thought about being 28, working a job you were good at getting something wrong in front of a room full of people, because someone in a back kitchen made a mistake you had no control over, and then having someone use that mistake to take you apart in public. She thought about how that felt. She thought about whether she had, in the last 15 years of her life, ever stopped to think about how that felt. She had a memory, sudden and unbidden, of being 23. A conference room in Paris. Her first major pitch to a group of European investors, and the presentation file had corrupted on the laptop, and she'd had to deliver the entire thing from memory. And the man leading the meeting had said in front of everyone that perhaps she should have prepared more thoroughly, and she had stood there and absorbed that and smiled and kept going because there was nothing else you could do. She remembered exactly how that felt. She remembered it precisely. "Thank you," she said to Lucas when he finished with the dessert menu. He looked at her, not suspicious, not wounded, just attentive the way good waitstaff were attentive. "Of course," he said. She ordered the chocolate tart. After he left, she sat for a moment, and Philippe started talking about something related to the venture deal, which was the reason all of them were here, which was the thing that the whole evening had been constructed around. And Vivian turned her attention to it, because that was what she did. She moved forward. She stayed present. She handled what was in front of her. But something had come loose. Some small, load-bearing thing that she hadn't known was holding something else up, and she could feel the shift of weight. Across the room, Emma Hayes was eating a chocolate tart of her own and appeared to be delivering what looked like a very thorough review of it to her father, complete with hand gestures. Daniel was listening with his full attention, elbows on the table, chin in his hand, looking at his daughter the way you look at something that is without question the best thing in your life. Vivian watched this for just a moment. Then she looked down at her own plate. The chocolate tart arrived. It was perfect. The pastry kitchen at Ardoise was as always beyond reproach. She took one bite and set her fork down and did not pick it up again. She had a lot of money. She had a penthouse and a Bordeaux house and a flat in Milan and 31 countries worth of business and 4 languages and a table at restaurants like this one whenever she wanted. She had not in a very long time looked at someone the way Daniel Hayes was looking at Emma. She was not entirely sure she had anything right now that was worth looking at that way. Philippe said something that required a response, and she gave it smooth and immediate the way she always could. That was the particular skill of people like her, the ability to operate multiple levels simultaneously, to have a conversation and think something else entirely without either suffering. But the something else was getting louder. The evening ended. Investors said their goodbyes. Cars were arranged. Philippe hugged her in the European way, both cheeks, and said the meeting had been productive. Isabel shook her hand and said she'd send the figures on Monday. May gathered her bag and her tablet and stood a careful distance to the side waiting. Vivian stepped back from the table. She looked across the restaurant one more time. Daniel and Emma were at the door getting their coats. Emma was trying to get both arms in her jacket simultaneously, which was not working, and Daniel reached over and held one sleeve open for her while she navigated, and Emma got her arm in and looked up at him in triumph, and he said something that made her laugh once, loud, the kind of laugh that doesn't care who hears it. And then Emma turned. She looked directly at Vivian, and she smiled, not carefully, not strategically, just openly, the way a 9-year-old smiles when she doesn't have a single reason not to. Which was also. Vivian realized the way a 9-year-old smiles when her father has raised her to believe that kindness doesn't require an excuse. Vivian stood there. She had spoken at 100 conferences. She had negotiated deals in 4 languages across 6 time zones. She had faced down regulatory boards and hostile media and investors who'd wanted to take her company from her, and she had handled all of it. She could not figure out what to do with this smile. She managed a small nod. Emma turned back to her father, took his hand, and walked out. Vivian stood in the middle of the restaurant in the quiet that followed, and felt for the first time in a very long while the specific uncomfortable sensation of having been seen accurately. Not flattered, not managed, not impressed, just seen. It was not a feeling she was used to. It was not a feeling she could easily name. But it stayed with her all the way out of the restaurant, into the car across the city, up to the penthouse floor, and into the too large, too quiet apartment where she set her bag down on the kitchen counter and stood in the dark for a moment before turning the lights on. She poured a glass of water. She stood at the window. The city below was indifferent and enormous and full of light. She thought about a man who had learned 5 languages not for business and not for prestige, and not so that he could perform them at a dinner table to make investors feel that they were in the presence of someone exceptional. She thought about what it actually meant to learn a language not from a class, not from an app, but from being in a place where people needed you to understand them and couldn't afford to wait while you caught up. She had a memory she hadn't thought about in years. She was 26 in Lyon for 6 months before she'd built anything when she'd been almost nobody and almost broke. And she'd walked into a bakery every single morning because it was cheap, and the woman behind the counter had one day corrected her French with patience and without condescension, and that small daily act of being treated like someone worth the effort of correction had done something to her sense of herself that she could still feel the shape of even now. She had forgotten that woman. She could not remember her name. She thought about the immigrant children Daniel taught languages to on Saturdays for free, without posting about it, without putting it in a bio. She thought about what she'd done with what she had. She thought about what he'd done with what he had. The city below didn't have any answers. It never did. But it held the question comfortably the way cities did, full of 10,000 simultaneous stories that never knew they were adjacent to each other. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. In the morning, she was in her office by 7, which was usual, and by 7:15 she had asked her research assistant to pull everything available on the humanitarian organization listed in Daniel Hayes's LinkedIn history, which was not usual at all. Her assistant, a meticulous young man named Cal, who had worked for her for 3 years and had learned to simply execute without asking why, had a full file in her inbox by 8:30. She read it in 20 minutes. Then she read it again. The organization was mid-sized as these things went. They operated across 4 continents. Their focus was post-disaster coordination, not the frontline emergency response that got the press coverage, but the harder, slower, less glamorous work that came after rebuilding supply chains, setting up education continuity, coordinating between dozens of local agencies that all had different priorities and different resources and different languages and different reasons to distrust each other. The work that required someone who could walk into a room of people who didn't want to cooperate and make them understand why they had to. Daniel Hayes had spent 5 years doing that work in 9 countries. She found a small profile piece from 6 years ago in an NGO newsletter, the kind of publication that had a readership of about 400 people that mentioned him by name. It described him as one of the most effective field coordinators we've had in the post-earthquake Sri Lanka operation, and quoted a local official who said that Hayes had been the reason 3 separate aid organizations had managed to stop competing over the same territory and start covering more ground instead. The quote from the local official was, "He came in speaking Sinhala badly and left speaking it less badly, and the whole time he treated every person he talked to like their opinion was the one that mattered. You do not forget someone like that." Vivian read that sentence 3 times. She thought about what it meant to make every person in a room feel like their opinion was the one that mattered. She thought about her own skill set. She was very good at making the right person in the room feel that way. The important one. The one whose signature you needed. She was excellent at it. She had never, she realized, tried to do it for everyone simultaneously. The thought sat with her at her desk all morning through 2 conference calls and a contract review and a video meeting with the Bordeaux team about a supply issue. She handled all of it competently, the way she handled everything. But a part of her was still in the restaurant, still watching a man in an old blazer cut the better piece of duck and slide it to his daughter, still watching him stand up from his chair with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided what kind of person he was and didn't need the room to agree. By early afternoon, she had learned 3 other things about Daniel Hayes. The first was that his wife had died 4 years ago. Cancer. She'd been 34. Emma would have been 5. The second was that Daniel had closed his last international assignment early to come home. He had been in Turkey when it happened. He had gotten on a plane within 6 hours of the call. The third was that he had been offered a senior position at the organization's New York headquarters 2 years after coming home, which would have been a significant professional step up and would have paid him approximately 3 times what a small auto repair shop on the west side of Manhattan could generate, and he had declined it. She sat with these 3 things. She thought about what it meant to come home from Turkey in 6 hours. She thought about what it cost a person, what it built in a person to do that, and then to take the quieter, smaller, more invisible road, because the most important person in the world needed you present and grounded and there. She thought about what she would have done in the same situation. She was not sure she liked what the thought produced. Cal knocked on her open office door. "You have the 2 o'clock with the Shanghai team." "Push it 30 minutes. He blinked. She never pushed things. "Of course." He closed the door. She picked up her phone. She sat for a long moment. Then she did something she almost never did, which was call someone without knowing exactly what she was going to say. The auto repair shop's number had been listed on the LLC filing, which Cal had pulled along with everything else. She dialed it. It rang twice. A man answered. His voice was the same voice she'd heard in the restaurant, even and low, and with a quality underneath it that she still couldn't quite name. Not calm exactly, something more active than calm. Present. Fully present the way some people were and most people weren't. "Hayes Auto," he said. She opened her mouth. For the first time in as long as she could remember, nothing came out. She had 4 languages. She had given keynote speeches to rooms of 1,000 people. She had delivered hard news to boards, and bad news to investors, and complex news to regulators. She had never once in her professional life found herself without the right word for a situation. The silence stretched. 1 second. 2. "Hello," he said. "Mr. Hayes," she said. A pause. He recognized her voice. She knew he did from the small quality of that pause. "Ms. Moreau," he said. Not a question. Not surprised. Not hostile. Just acknowledgement. The way he had said most things clear and direct and without unnecessary decoration. She had planned to open with something professional, something that reframed the conversation on terms she controlled. She had been doing that in one form or another for 20 years. Instead, she said, "I want to apologize." Another pause. "Okay," he said. Not, "You don't have to," or I appreciate that, or any of the social softeners that people used to make apologies easier on the person giving them. Just okay. He was going to let her do it without making it comfortable. She found that she respected that. What I said in the restaurant, she began, and then stopped, because she needed to be specific, because vague apologies were a kind of avoidance, and she'd spent enough of the morning being honest with herself that she was going to finish that work properly. What I said about the dress code, and what I said in French about people eating out of their price range, and the way I spoke to your waiter, all of it. I want to apologize for all of it. The line was quiet. She could hear in this background the sound of something mechanical, a radio, the distant clank of something metallic, the ordinary background noise of a man at work on a weekday morning. Thank you, Daniel said. I don't want it to be just words. What do you want it to be? She looked out the window at the city below her. 31 stories up, clean glass, perfect view. I'm not sure yet, she said. But I'm working on it. She heard something change in his voice then. Not warmth exactly, but the first small shift toward it. The door cracking, not opening. That's a better answer than most people would give. I've spent the morning reading about your work, she said. The coordination work, in Sri Lanka and the others. A pause. Why? Because last night I made an assumption about you based on what I could see, and I needed to understand how wrong I was. I don't need you to understand my resume, he said. And it wasn't cold, but it was clear. The apology doesn't require that. No, she agreed. It doesn't. I wasn't doing it for the apology. I was doing it for myself. He was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said again. Your daughter, Vivian said. She smiled at me. When you were leaving. The background sounds continued. She heard him move. Yeah, he said. She does that. It was... She stopped. She tried 3 different words in her head and set all 3 of them aside. Finally, she said, It was the most uncomplicated thing that happened to me last night. He didn't respond to that. She hadn't expected him to. Some things weren't looking for a response. I'd like to have a conversation, she said. About the language program you run, for immigrant children? Now the pause was different. Longer. She could almost hear him recalibrating. How do you know about that? He said. I looked you up. People have looked me up before, he said slowly. They don't usually call to talk about the Saturday program. I imagine they don't, she said. I'm not most people. No, he said. I don't think you are. She waited. He said, What kind of conversation? The kind where I come and see what you're doing, she said. And then we talk about what it could be if it had more resources. The kind where I actually listen, instead of deciding in advance what I think. The longest pause yet. Then, in the same unhurried voice he'd used in the restaurant, the same voice that had said 5 things in 5 languages without asking anyone's permission and without needing their approval. Saturday mornings, Daniel said. We start at 9. She wrote it down. She said, I'll be there. She ended the call. She sat at her desk. The Shanghai meeting would have to wait another few minutes more, because she was sitting with the unfamiliar sensation of having made a commitment that she wasn't in control, of a commitment that would require her to walk into a room and not know the rules in advance and not be the most important person there. She had not done that in a very long time. She was not sure what it was going to feel like. She thought about a man who had walked into rooms like that for 5 years on 4 continents, badly speaking the local language, and had made himself useful anyway. She thought about what kind of person that required you to be. She picked up her pen. She wrote the address down. Saturday, 9 o'clock. She put the pen down, and for the first time since the restaurant, the thing that had come loose inside her stopped feeling like damage and started feeling like the necessary first step towards something she didn't yet have a name for, but could just barely at the edges begin to sense the shape of. Saturday came with the kind of gray November cold that settled into your coat before you'd finished buttoning it. Vivian Moreau arrived at the address Daniel had given her at 8:53 in the morning. She had considered sending Cal ahead to scout the location. She had decided against it. She had also considered arriving in the car with the driver and decided against that too. She took a cab. She wore a wool coat that was expensive, but not obviously so, and she carried nothing except her phone and a notebook. The building was a converted community center on a block that had seen better decades. The exterior was worn, but not neglected. Someone had painted the front door recently dark green clean edges. There was a hand-lettered sign taped inside the window. She had to lean close to read it. It said, Saturday Language Circle. All welcome. 9 a.m. Below that, in smaller letters in what she recognized as Spanish Arabic and what she thought might be Somali, the same message 3 times. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at that sign for a moment. Then she pushed the door open. The noise hit her first. Not loud noise, organized noise. The specific productive chaos of a room full of children who are engaged in something and don't care who's watching. There were maybe 30 kids' ages ranging from what looked like 6 to 14 spread across tables that had been arranged in clusters. On each table were notebooks, printed sheets, and small handmade cards with words on them in 2 languages. 3 adult volunteers were moving between the clusters. Daniel was in the far corner, crouched down to the level of a boy who looked about 8, pointing at something on a piece of paper and saying something Vivian couldn't yet hear. Nobody looked up when she walked in. That was unusual. In most rooms when Vivian Moreau walked in, something shifted. She had been aware of this for so long, it had become background noise the way your own heartbeat is background noise until you suddenly hear it. This room did not shift. These children had their own gravitational field, and she was not part of it. She stood near the door. A woman appeared beside her. Late 30s, dark-haired, carrying a stack of folders. She extended a hand. Hi, I'm Rosa. Are you here for a child, or are you volunteering today? Vivian paused. I'm here to see Daniel Hayes. He's expecting me. Rosa glanced across the room. He's with Miguel right now. Miguel had a rough week at school, so they're doing catch-up. It might be a few minutes. She said this as simply as she'd say anything else. Not apologetically, just as information. You can grab coffee in the back. It's not great coffee, but it's hot. Thank you, Vivian said. You're welcome. Rosa was already moving away, handing out folders as she went. Vivian got the coffee. It was as promised, not great. She held it and stayed near the wall and watched the room. The boy Daniel was working with Miguel apparently had his arms crossed and his jaw set in the way that children held their bodies when they were embarrassed and trying not to show it. Daniel was saying something. She was close enough to hear now. He was speaking in Spanish, but slowly the way you speak when you want the other person to catch every word. You didn't fail the test, Daniel said. You answered the questions the way you understood them. That's different. Miguel looked at the paper. The teacher said I failed. The teacher said your score wasn't passing. That's a grade. It's not the same as failing as a person. It feels the same. Yeah, Daniel said. I know it does. I failed an entire language exam my second year in the field, Portuguese. I'd been speaking it for 8 months in a place where people needed me to speak it well, and I still didn't pass the standardized test. Miguel looked up. What did you do? I went back the next week and passed it. And the week after that, I helped translate a conversation that got 200 families access to clean water. The boy was quiet. The test is not the point, Daniel said. The test is just a way of measuring where you are. It's not a way of measuring who you are. Miguel uncrossed his arms. Not all the way, but enough. Vivian looked at her coffee. She thought about a boardroom 2 years ago, where she'd told a mid-level manager in front of his team, because she'd been in a hurry and hadn't thought about what it would cost him that his proposal was underprepared and he should come back when he had something worth presenting. She thought about the look on his face. She had not thought about that look since the moment it happened, because there were 100 things on either side of it that needed her attention, and she had moved on. She was thinking about it now. Daniel stood. He hadn't looked her way yet, but he said without turning, "Vivian, give me 2 minutes." She wasn't sure whether to be impressed or unsettled that he'd clocked her arrival without looking. She said, "Take your time." She meant it. He spent 4 minutes finishing with Miguel, not 2, because the boy had one more question, and Daniel answered it completely, instead of cutting it short. And then he got the kids set up with a worksheet and a volunteer named James, who had the patient, unhurried manner of a retired teacher, and only then did he cross the room to where Vivian was standing. He looked the same as he had in the restaurant, which was to say he looked like himself. Same jeans, different shirt, no blazer. He had a coffee of his own, which he raised slightly as a greeting. "You came," he said. "I said I would." "People say a lot of things." She didn't argue with that. "I know." He looked at her for a moment, that direct, undramatic assessment, that she remembered the look that didn't need anything from her. Then he said, "Come on, I'll show you how it works." For the next hour, Vivian Moreau did something she genuinely could not remember doing. In recent professional history, she followed someone else's lead without redirecting it. Daniel walked her through the room. He introduced her to the children, not by her name or her title, but simply as someone who wanted to learn what we do here. The kids accepted this with the indifference of people who had more important things to think about. He showed her the system, each child paired with a language buddy practicing vocabulary through conversation rather than rote memorization. The principle, he explained, was that language learned in relationship stuck in a way that language learned from a worksheet didn't. "You learned that in the field," she said. "I learned it from being bad at languages in places where being bad at them had real consequences," he said. "You learn faster when you need to. And these kids need to. Most of them are functioning in 2 worlds simultaneously. Home language, school language. Some of them are translating for their parents at age 10. Helping their families navigate systems that are confusing even in English." He stopped near a table where 2 girls were practicing numbers in what Vivian now recognized as Somali. "The least we can do is make sure the language they're learning in school doesn't feel like it's asking them to abandon the one they already have." Vivian watched the 2 girls. One of them made a mistake, and the other corrected her without a trace of judgment in the easy, matter-of-fact way that children corrected each other when they were actually friends. "How long have you been running this?" she asked. 3 years. Started with 6 kids and a donated folding table. And now, 32 kids, 3 regular volunteers, some donated materials. We rotate through 4 languages depending on enrollment." He looked at her. "And about $40 a week in supplies that I buy myself because we don't have a budget line for it." She heard the number clearly. She did not react to it visibly. "Who else knows about this program?" she said. "The families, the volunteers, the school counselor at PS 147 who refers kids to us. Rosa's been doing outreach at the community board." He stopped. "Why? I'm trying to understand why you've been running this for 3 years at $40 a week out of your own pocket instead of what he said, and it wasn't defensive, but it was direct. "Instead of writing grants, I tried. The turnaround on foundation grants is 8 months to 2 years. I have kids who need it now. Instead of going to donors, I don't have connections to donors." He looked at her calmly. "Or I didn't." She held that. "I'm not here to write a check and leave," she said. "I didn't think you were." He studied her. "But I want to understand what you are here for." It was a fair question. She'd been asking herself the same thing since Thursday night. She'd dressed it in different language investment opportunity, community impact, CSR infrastructure, but underneath all of it was the same thing, and she'd spent enough of the last 48 hours being honest with herself to not dress it up now. "I was wrong about you," she said. "In the restaurant. I made an assumption based on what I could see, and it was completely wrong. And then you showed me not to prove anything, not for me specifically. You just showed me what you knew, what you'd done, what you were." She paused. "And it made me think about what I'd done with what I have." Daniel was quiet. "I've given to causes," she said. "I have a foundation. We fund scholarships and arts programs and medical research. And all of it is run by professionals who manage it so that I can focus on the business. And that works. The money is real, and it does real things. She looked at the two girls still practicing Somali across the room. But I have not in a very long time been in a room where the work was actually happening. And, he said, and I think I needed to be. He looked at her for a moment in that way he had, assessing without pressure, thinking without hurrying. Then he said, "What do you need from me to make that true?" She almost said nothing. She stopped herself because nothing was the answer you gave when you were trying to seem low maintenance, and she was done with that particular habit. "Tell me what this program needs," she said. "Not the polished version, the real version." He looked at her for just long enough that she thought he might be deciding something. Then he said, "Sit down." They sat at an empty table near the back. Around them, the room continued its productive noise. James was doing something with flashcards that was producing a lot of competitive shouting from three boys who were apparently very motivated by the concept of winning at vocabulary. Rosa was across the room arbitrating some kind of dispute over a pencil with the unruffled authority of someone who had seen much worse. Daniel talked. Not quickly, not with a pitch deck or a prepared framework. He talked the way people talked when they actually knew something, with specific details, with real numbers, with the names of actual children and actual families and actual obstacles. He needed a consistent space because the community center charged them rent they couldn't always cover. He needed basic teaching materials, not fancy, just consistent. He needed a coordinator who could spend 2 days a week on it because he was running it on the margins of his actual job, and there was a limit to how long margins held. Most of all, he said he needed the program to be able to expand to a second site. There was a school on the east side of the borough with a similar population, and a counselor who had been calling him for 4 months, asking if he could replicate what he did here. He had not been able to say yes. Because of resources, Vivian said. Because of time, mostly. Resources second. What if I could solve the resources part? He looked at her. Not as a charity, she said immediately, because she'd been thinking about how to say this. Not as a company putting its name on something. I'll fund it through the foundation quietly with no branding requirements. You stay in control of how it runs. I'm a resource, not a director. He was very still. Why? He said. Because you've been doing this right for 3 years with nothing, she said. The last thing it needs is someone with money showing up and changing how it runs. He looked at his coffee. She watched him think. She had made larger offers to people at larger tables and had never once been uncertain about how they'd land. This one, she was uncertain about. Not because of the money was not the point, but because the thing she was actually offering was harder to name. She was offering to take direction from someone. She was offering to be in a room without controlling it. She was offering in some way she couldn't fully articulate to become a different kind of person than she had been at a restaurant table 6 days ago. There are conditions, Daniel said. Tell me. You don't use this for press. Not mine, not the programs, not the kids. These families are private. Some of them have complicated documentation situations, and they need to be able to come here without worrying about visibility. Understood. You show up in person at least once a month. Not to observe, to participate. You'll be assigned a vocabulary station, and you'll work it like anyone else. She blinked. You want me to run a vocabulary station? I want you to be useful, he said. There's a difference between funding something and being part of it. You said you wanted to be in a room where the work was happening. This is what that means. She thought about it. She thought about standing at a table with a stack of flashcards and a 9-year-old across from her who did not care about Maison Moreau or 31 countries or the covers of 7 business magazines. Okay, she said. Third condition. He met her eyes. If this works and we expand to the second site, you help us find a coordinator, not someone from a staffing agency, someone who's been in this kind of work, someone who knows what it actually is. I can do that. Through your network, the humanitarian organizations, the field people. You know people in those circles, she said. I know people who do the work, he said. "You know people who fund the work. Between the two of us, we probably know enough." She looked at him. Something about the way he'd said "between the two of us" landed differently than she'd expected. Not like a partnership pitch, just as a fact stated plainly. Two people with different resources and the same direction. The simplest possible math. "Between the two of us," she said quietly. "Yeah, probably." He put his hand out across the table. She shook it. It was not the kind of handshake she was used to. It was not the handshake of a deal, where everyone was already calculating the next move. It was the handshake of two people deciding to actually do something which was different and less common, and she thought more real. Rosa appeared at Daniel's elbow. "Daniel, Miguel's asking for you again." He glanced over. The 8-year-old across the room had his hand up and was looking around with the specific urgency of a kid who needs help and doesn't want to look like he needs help. "Go," Vivian said. He went. She sat alone at the table. Around her, the room kept going. 32 kids in the middle of learning that words were bridges, exactly like Daniel had said in the restaurant. Learning it not as a principle, but as an experience, sitting across from someone and finding that a word in a new language could land like recognition, could say, "I see where you come from. I'm trying to meet you there." She picked up a flashcard that had been left on the table. One side apple. The other side, a word in Arabic she couldn't read. She turned it over a few times. Then Emma Hayes walked through the front door. Vivian had not expected this. She recognized her immediately. The dark eyes, the same quality of attention her father had the 9-year-old's, complete lack of pretense. Emma was wearing a backpack and carrying what looked like a homemade banner rolled up under her arm. She scanned the room, found what she was looking for, and cut through the clusters of kids with the ease of someone who came here often and knew exactly where everything was. She stopped when she saw Vivian. The two of them looked at each other across the table. Emma said, "You're the wine lady." Vivian sat very still. "Yes." "Dad said you might come." Emma studied her. "He didn't say what I was supposed to say to you." "You don't have to say anything to me." "Okay." Emma put her banner down on the table and started unrolling it. It was hand-painted in large, careful letters on what looked like paper from a craft store. It said, "Words are bridges." Around the letters were small painted figures of people in different colors crossing toward each other. "Did you make that?" Vivian asked. "Me and Dad made it last night. He said we needed a new sign for the bulletin board." "It's good." Emma looked at it critically. "My bridges are crooked." "Bridges usually are," Vivian said. "The important thing is whether they hold." Emma looked at her. It was the same look from the restaurant door, but different now. Not the open, unguarded smile of a kid who didn't know what had just happened. This was the look of a 9-year-old who was thinking something specific. "Were you mean to my dad?" Emma said. The room continued around them. Nobody was listening. Vivian didn't look away. "Yes," she said. "I was." "At the restaurant?" "Yes." "Why?" She could have softened it. She could have given a version that was technically true, but easier to hand to a child. She thought about Daniel telling Miguel that a score was a grade, and not a verdict on who you were. And she thought about what kind of person you had to be to raise a daughter who would ask this question this directly and wait this calmly for the answer. "Because," she said, "I looked at your father, and I thought I knew what he was. And I was wrong." Emma thought about this. "He says that's the most common mistake people make." He's right. He also says the second most common mistake is not doing anything about it after you find out you were wrong. Vivian looked at the child sitting across from her. She thought about all the things she'd prepared to say in the last 6 days. All the framings and approaches and professional language she'd assembled and then set aside. She thought about a man who had learned 5 languages because people needed him to, who had come home from Turkey in 6 hours, who spent his Saturdays at a folding table with immigrant kids, who had stood up in a restaurant for a 28-year-old waiter and not asked anyone's permission. She thought about what it meant to raise a daughter who at 9 years old could look across a table at a billionaire and ask the hard question and wait for the honest answer. "Your dad is doing something about it," Vivian said. "And so am I." Emma looked at her for one more moment. Then she picked up her banner and said, "Do you know how to use a staple gun?" Vivian blinked. Yes, I believe so." "Good." Emma stood up. "The bulletin board is in the back, and Dad says I'm not allowed to use the staple gun without an adult." Vivian stood up. She followed Emma through the room to the bulletin board in the back, where a 9-year-old handed her a staple gun and held the banner at the corners and told her where to put the staples, and Vivian Moreau, who had spoken at 100 conferences and negotiated in 4 languages, and owned a penthouse and a Bordeaux house and a flat in Milan, put the staples where she was told carefully, in the spots Emma pointed to. Words are bridges, crooked bridges and all. When they stepped back to look at it, Emma tilted her head. "Better," she said. "Much better." Vivian agreed. Daniel appeared behind them. He looked at the banner. He looked at the staple gun in Vivian's hand. He looked at his daughter, who had the expression of someone who had handled a situation and found it satisfactory. "Did you put her to work?" he said to Emma. "She said she knew how to use a staple gun," Emma said reasonably. Daniel looked at Vivian. Vivian looked back at him. She felt for the first time since Thursday night something that was lighter than what had been sitting in her chest. Not resolved, there was too much she still needed to think about, still needed to figure out how to become for anything to be resolved. But lighter, like a window in a room that had been closed for a long time. "The offer stands," she said. "All 3 conditions, starting next Saturday if you want." He was quiet for a moment. "The program needs a name," he said. "Something official, for the foundation paperwork." She thought about it. She looked at the banner. "Emma named it," she said. "Already. 3 words." He followed her eyes to the banner. He read it. He was quiet for a longer moment than she expected. When he looked back, something in his face had shifted. Not much, not dramatically. He was not a man who did things dramatically. But something had moved behind his eyes, the way something moves when you recognize a thing that belongs. "Words are bridges," he said. "If you want," she said. He nodded once. Emma, standing between them, looked from one adult to the other, with the patient expression of a child who doesn't fully understand what the grown-ups are doing, but can tell it's important. "Can we have lunch after?" she said. Daniel looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at Daniel. "Is there a place nearby?" she said. "There's a taco cart 2 blocks over," he said. "It's not Ardoise." "No," she said. "But I imagine it's better." He almost smiled. "It is," he said, significantly. They left the building at noon, all 3 of them, Emma between them on the sidewalk, the city cold and gray and indifferent as it always was, full of 10,000 things that didn't know they were happening next to each other. A 9-year-old with a half-empty backpack walking between a mechanic who spoke 5 languages and a billionaire who was learning for the first time in a very long time what it meant to be in a room without controlling it. Emma reached up. She took Daniel's hand with her right and Vivian's hand with her left. Neither adult had expected it. Neither pulled away. They walked toward the taco cart, and 2 blocks of November sidewalk had never, Vivian thought, felt more like a beginning. The taco cart, 2 blocks from the community center, became, without anyone planning it, a fixed point. Every Saturday after the session ended, the 3 of them walked there. Emma ordered the same thing every time, 2 tacos with extra salsa and a horchata, and delivered a detailed performance review of the morning while eating, pointing out which kids had improved and which volunteers had done a good job, and which flashcard games were getting boring and needed to be replaced. Daniel listened and occasionally corrected small details. Vivian listened and said less and less each week because she was learning that listening was a skill she had significantly underdeveloped, and that the best way to practice it was to be around people who had things worth saying. By the 3rd Saturday, she had stopped checking her phone during the session. By the 5th, she had stopped bringing it in from the car. This was not a small thing. Cal, her assistant, had initially responded to her new Saturday unavailability with the polite panic of someone whose entire professional framework had just been restructured without warning. He'd sent 3 texts the first week, 2 the second, and 1 the third, that just said, "Everything is fine. Have a good morning," which Vivian suspected was his way of telling her that he had it handled, and she should stay wherever she was. She appreciated that more than she said. What she was doing on those Saturday mornings was harder to name than she'd expected. She had been assigned, as Daniel promised, a vocabulary station. Her table had a set of laminated cards, a dry erase board, and whoever Rosa sent her way that morning, which was usually 2 to 4 kids between the ages of 7 and 11, who ranged from shy to aggressively competitive about correct answers. She learned their names quickly. Amara, Diego, Priya. A boy named Kevin, who told her on the second Saturday, with complete seriousness, that he already knew more Spanish than she did and was willing to help her if she needed it. She had told him with equal seriousness that she would take him up on that. Kevin had looked briefly unsure whether she was joking. She was not joking. By the 4th Saturday, Kevin was correcting her Spanish pronunciation with the same unfiltered authority that Daniel's daughter used for everything, and Vivian was accepting the corrections the way she was learning to accept things in this room, without deflection, without the professional armor, just straight. It was not comfortable. She was beginning to understand the point. What she had not anticipated, what she could not have anticipated from the outside, which was where she'd been spending most of her time for the past decade, was how much she would come to understand about the children at her table simply by paying attention to how they held a word. Some kids grabbed at new vocabulary aggressively, like they were collecting something. Others approached it sideways, testing it privately before committing to it out loud. Some lit up at the recognition of a word from home in a new context, a flash of something behind the eyes that was closer to relief than excitement. Like proof that where they came from had not been left behind entirely. She mentioned this to Daniel on the 6th Saturday at the taco cart. He looked at her over his coffee cup. "You're seeing it," he said. "I don't know what to do with it," she said. "You don't have to do anything with it. It's just true. The kids who have the hardest time aren't always the ones with the biggest language gaps. They're the ones who think learning English means losing something else. Once you deal with that, the vocabulary takes care of itself." How do you deal with it? You tell them the truth. Learning a new language doesn't replace the one you have. It builds on top of it. Every language you have is one more way to be understood. He took a drink, which is what most people are actually looking for. Emma was eating her taco and not participating in this conversation, but Vivian had learned that Emma's non-participation was not the same as non-attention. Sure enough, without looking up from her food, Emma said, "That's why Dad says words are bridges, not doors. Bridges go both ways. Doors only open one direction." Vivian looked at her. Daniel looked at her. Emma kept eating. "How long has she been this wise?" Vivian asked. "Since about age 6, Daniel said. "It's been mildly terrifying." That was week 6. Week 7 was when things shifted in a direction none of them had planned for. It started with a phone call. Vivian was in her office on a Wednesday afternoon when her foundation director, a careful and competent woman named Sandra, who had been running Moreau Foundation operations for 4 years, appeared in the doorway with an expression that Vivian had learned meant something has happened that is going to require a conversation. Sandra sat down. She said she needed to talk about the Words Are Bridges funding allocation. The paperwork had been processed, the first disbursement had gone through, and then a journalist from a mid-sized business publication had called the foundation asking for a comment on Moreau's new community initiative. Vivian was very still. "I didn't announce anything." "No," Sandra said. "But someone did. The publication received a tip. They're saying they have documentation of the funding agreement." Vivian thought immediately of the conditions Daniel had set on the first Saturday. "You don't use this for press." She thought about the families with complicated documentation situations who needed to come to that room without worrying about visibility. "Who tipped them?" she said. Sandra hesitated. The tip appears to have come from someone within our foundation's network, possibly someone connected to one of the investor contacts from the Ardoise dinner. She paused. Philippe Renault's communications office made 3 calls to this publication in the last month. Vivian heard this. She sat with it for 5 seconds. Then she called Daniel. He picked up on the second ring. There were background workshop sounds which told her he was at the shop. She didn't give him preamble because he wasn't a person who needed it. "A journalist is going to call you," she said. "About words or bridges. I didn't initiate it. It came from someone in my network who I believe was trying to cause a problem. I want you to know before it happens, and I want you to know that I'm going to handle it." Silence on his end. Not a surprise silence. Not an angry one either, which she'd been braced for. A thinking silence. "How?" he said. "I'm going to tell the publication there's no story yet, and that any coverage of the program or its participants before we've had a chance to establish proper privacy protocols would be something my legal team would need to look at very carefully." "That's the stick," he said. "Is there a carrot?" She hadn't expected him to phrase it that way. She almost smiled. "I'll offer them exclusive access to a legitimate story in 6 months. The program, the expansion, the results. Full access. On our terms and with consent from every family involved. And the person who tipped them." She paused. "Philippe and I have an existing business relationship." "I'm not asking you to burn a business relationship," Daniel said. "I'm asking what you're going to say to him." She thought about what she was going to say to Philippe. She had been thinking about it since Sandra had said his name. They had known each other for 11 years. He had been at her table the night at Ardoise. He had been the one to make the Italian comment that had opened the door to everything. She did not think Philippe had done this out of malice exactly. She thought he had done it the way people did things when they wanted to remind a room of its order, when someone had disrupted a hierarchy that they were comfortable with and they wanted to gently restore it. She thought he had seen Vivian's involvement with Daniel as a strange deviation that needed a frame, a story that put it back into a category he understood. Billionaire's pet project. Vivian doing charity. Vivian finding a cause. She thought about what she was going to say. "I'm going to tell him the truth," she said. Daniel said, which is, that he made an assumption about the situation based on what he could see, and he was wrong. She let that land. Sounds familiar? Another silence. Then for the first time since she'd known him, Daniel Hayes laughed. Not a polite laugh. An actual laugh, short and real, the kind that meant something had caught him off guard. "Call me after you talk to the publication," he said. "I will." She called the journalist first. She handled it precisely the way she'd told Daniel she would, the quiet legal implication, then the genuine offer. The journalist who was professional and reasonable and actually more interested in a real story than a rushed one accepted. She called Philippe second. She did not send a message. She did not have Cal set up the call. She dialed his cell number directly, which she had never used for business in 11 years. And when he answered in French, she replied in English, which for anyone who knew Vivian Moreau was its own kind of signal. She told him what she knew. He denied it for approximately 45 seconds. Then he stopped denying it. Then he said in the tone of someone making a reasonable point, "Vivian, I only thought the exposure would be good for you. This kind of visibility, a powerful woman giving back in a personal, authentic way, it's a good story." "I know it's a good story," she said. "That's not the point." "Then what is?" She thought about 32 kids at laminated tables. She thought about Miguel with his arms crossed. She thought about families with complicated documentation situations who needed to come to a green-doored building on a Saturday morning without worrying that someone was going to make a story out of them. "The point," she said, "is that these are real people, not a story, not visibility, not a brand moment." She paused. "I know that's a strange concept. It was strange to me too until recently." Philippe was quiet. "Don't do it again," she said. It was not a request. She hung up. She sat at her desk. She had been having a lot of moments lately of sitting at her desk in the aftermath of something and feeling the specific weight of who she was, becoming different from who she had been. It was not always comfortable. It was sometimes disorienting, in the way that any real change was disorienting, not because it was wrong, but because you were moving through territory that didn't have landmarks yet. She called Daniel back. "It's handled," she said. "The family's protected. I'll send you the agreement I made with the journalist so you can see exactly what was promised." "Thank you," he said. She was about to say, of course, the automatic social response, and stopped herself because of course implied this was nothing, and it wasn't nothing. It had cost her something. A clean relationship with a longtime colleague. A certain ease. She had done it anyway, because there was no version of keeping the conditions she'd agreed to that didn't require actually keeping them. "You're welcome," she said instead. "For real." A pause on his end. "Emma's been asking about you," he said. She was not expecting that. "About me. She wants to know if you're coming to the winter showcase. The kids are doing a presentation. Each of them teaches the room one word in their home language." He stopped. It was Emma's idea, actually. She said if the program's name is Words or Bridges, there should be a day where everyone brings a word from home. Vivian thought about a 9-year-old with crooked painted bridges and a staple gun. "When is it?" she said. He told her. She looked at her calendar. She had a dinner in Paris that weekend, a long-planned event, people she'd been trying to get in a room for 8 months. She looked at the dinner. She looked at the showcase date. She moved the Paris dinner. Not canceled, rescheduled 3 weeks out, which her team would manage with a carefully worded email and a sincere apology. Everyone would understand. Or they wouldn't, and it would be fine either way. She told Daniel she'd be there. He said, "Emma's going to want you at her table." "Tell her I'll bring the flashcards," Vivian said. The winter showcase was on a Friday evening in December, and the community center was warmer than usual, with the body heat of 32 kids and their families packed into a room that was already small. Someone had strung paper snowflakes along the windows. The bulletin board with the Words or Bridges banner was visible from the door. Someone had added to the banner since Vivian had last seen it, small handprints in different colors, surrounding the text, each one with a name written in it in careful letters. Vivian found Emma's handprint immediately. It was in yellow. The name was written in her particular 9-year-old cursive, slightly too large, the letters leaning forward like they were in a hurry. She was looking at it when Emma appeared at her elbow. "You came," Emma said. "I said I would." "I know." Emma was wearing a dress Vivian hadn't seen before, dark blue, clearly chosen with care. Her hair was in 2 braids that were slightly uneven in a way that suggested they had been done by a parent trying his best. "Dad said you moved a trip to Paris to be here." "I rescheduled it." Emma considered this. "Was it important?" "The showcase was more important," Vivian said simply. Emma looked at her with that direct, unfiltered assessment. "Okay," she said. "Come on, we're at the table by the window. I saved you a seat." The evening unfolded the way Daniel had described. Each child stood and said one word, just one in their home language. They said it, and then they explained what it meant, and then they wrote it on the board at the front, and then everyone in the room said it together. Amara's word was in Somali. It meant welcome, she said. But not just welcome, the way you said it at a door. Welcome the way you felt when you came back somewhere you'd been away from for a long time, and the place was still there, and still yours. Diego's word was in Spanish. It was a word for the specific feeling of missing someone who is still alive and still present, just far away. Priya's word was in Tamil. She said it was her grandmother's word for the hour just before sunrise, which her grandmother called the hour that belongs to everyone, because it hasn't been claimed by the day yet. Kevin's word was in Tagalog. He said it didn't translate directly. The closest thing in English was the weight of a debt you owe someone who will never ask you to repay it. He said his mom used it about his grandfather. He said he thought about it a lot. The room was very quiet when he finished. Daniel, standing at the back, was watching the faces of the parents. Vivian, from her seat at Emma's table, was watching Daniel. She saw something move across his face during Kevin's word. Just briefly. Something personal, something interior, something that came from a place he kept private. She didn't know exactly what it was. She knew it was real, and she knew it was none of her business, and she let it be. Emma went forth to last. She stood up and said her word was in English because that was the language she was learning this year, and she wanted to bring a word she'd learned here. The word is bridge, Emma said, which most people know. But I learned this year that a bridge is different from a door. A door only opens one way. A bridge goes both ways. And the most important thing about a bridge isn't what it's made of, it's what it connects. She looked at the room. My dad taught me that. But I think he learned it from being in a lot of places where people needed to find each other across something that felt too big to cross. She sat down. Vivian was looking at her hands on the table. She was not going to cry in a room full of children and their families. She had made this decision 30 seconds ago, and she was holding to it. You okay? Emma said quietly. Fine, Vivian said. Your braids are slightly different lengths. Emma put her hands up to her hair. Dad did them. He tries. They're good. They're crooked. Crooked things hold, Vivian said. You told me that. Emma dropped her hands. I told you that about bridges. Same principle. Emma looked at her. Then she leaned over and rested her head briefly against Vivian's arm, 1 second, maybe 2, just the weight of a 9-year-old's head against a wool sleeve. And then she sat back up and started talking to Amara across the table about something Vivian couldn't follow. Vivian sat very still. She thought about the weight of a debt you owe someone who will never ask you to repay it. She thought about how Kevin had said that was his grandfather. She thought about what the word was for what she owed a man who had stood up in a restaurant and shown her something true without intending to teach her anything at all, who had set 3 conditions and meant all of them, who had raised a daughter, that leaned her head on strangers' arms because it didn't occur to her not to. The evening ended with everyone in the room saying all 32 words together, which was chaotic and joyful and entirely too loud for the space, and which was exactly right. During the small reception, Daniel found her near the bulletin board. He stood beside her looking at the banner, the handprints, the crooked bridges. Well, he said. Well, she said. You moved Paris. I mentioned that. Emma mentioned it first. I was verifying. She looked at the handprints. The second site, she said. I found someone. For the coordinator position. She's been doing field coordination for 6 years. 2 of them in language education programs in refugee camps in Greece. She's looking to come home. He turned to look at her. Her name is Yolanda Park, Vivian said. She's 31. She's exactly what you described, someone who's been in the work. She paused. She'd be ready to start in February. Daniel was quiet for a moment. How did you find her? I made 12 calls, Vivian said, to people in my network who know field people. Most of them had never been asked that kind of question from me before. She paused. It was a useful exercise. He was still looking at her. I asked each of them, she continued, to think about someone they knew who did this work because it needed doing. Not for the resume, not for the visibility, just because it needed doing. She met his eyes. Her name came up 4 times independently. He looked back at the banner. That's a good method, he said. I learned it from watching someone pick up a vocabulary card in a room they didn't know yet, she said. And start anyway. He didn't respond to that, but he didn't look away from the banner either. Rosa appeared pulling on her coat keys in hand. Daniel, lock up tonight, James has to leave early. Yeah, he said. Good showcase, Rosa said. She glanced at Vivian. You're pretty decent with the flashcards. Kevin says you're improving. Kevin is a rigorous teacher, Vivian said. He really is. Rosa said it with the affection of someone who had watched this particular 9-year-old be rigorous at teachers for years. Night. She left. Emma came and found them. She was carrying her coat and the remaining horchata she'd apparently brought from the taco cart as a personal showcase provision, and she looked satisfied in the way of someone who had organized something and watched it go well. Dad, she said, can we get food? It's 9 o'clock. I know what time it is. Emma, I'm just saying. Daniel looked at Vivian. Are you? I'll come, she said. If that's… Obviously you're coming, Emma said, already heading for the door. That's why I said, can we not, can I? They looked at each other. Something passed between them that was not complicated and not simple. The particular look of two adults who have both been maneuvered by a 9-year-old and found they didn't mind. They followed Emma out into the December cold. The city was full of lights and noise, and the specific December energy of everyone being somewhere on their way to somewhere else. Emma walked between them, finishing her horchata, describing in detail the part of the showcase where a boy named Sebastian had said his words so quietly nobody had heard it, and they'd had to ask 3 times, and by the 3rd time he was red-faced and furious, and it was… Emma said actually very funny, even though she felt bad about it. Daniel was listening and saying the things parents said. Vivian was listening too, and not saying anything, and feeling underneath the cold and the December noise, and the perfectly ordinary activity of walking down a sidewalk, something she'd been building toward for 2 months without naming it. It wasn't gratitude exactly, though. There was gratitude in it. It wasn't guilt, though, that had been part of where it started. It was something quieter and more durable than either of those things. The particular feeling of being in the right place at the right time and knowing it, which was different from thinking it and different from hoping it. Emma reached up between them and took both their hands. Again. The same gesture as the first Saturday. Neither of them had expected it to become a habit. Neither of them walking through the December cold with a 9-year-old between them was the least bit interested in stopping it. Yolanda Park started on the first Monday of February, and by the end of her first week, Daniel knew he'd found the right person. She was 31 years old, and she moved through the community center like someone who had spent 6 years learning how to be useful in rooms that were barely holding together. She didn't ask where things were. She looked until she found them. She didn't wait to be introduced to the families. She introduced herself in whatever language got the warmest response and filed the information away with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that relationships were the actual infrastructure. Everything else was just furniture. By the end of week 2, 3 of the shyest kids in the program were talking to her like they'd known her for months. By week 3, she had identified 2 families who needed additional support outside the language program, and had already connected them with resources on her own time, without mentioning it to anyone until Daniel noticed and asked. "That's not technically in your job description," he said. "I know," she said. "Is it a problem?" He looked at her. "No," he said. "Good," she said, and went back to what she was doing. Vivian met her on the 3rd Saturday of February at the taco cart. The 4 of them, Daniel, Emma, Vivian, Yolanda, sat around the small outdoor table in the cold that Emma insisted was not that cold, and everyone else quietly disagreed with, and Vivian asked Yolanda what she needed for the second site, and Yolanda pulled out a handwritten list on a folded piece of notebook paper that was 3 pages long, front and back. Vivian looked at the list. "This is thorough," she said. "I had 6 years of practice writing lists like this in places where if you forgot something on the list, the consequence was a lot worse than inconvenience," Yolanda said. "So I tend to be complete." "That's exactly what we need," Vivian said. She took a photo of all 3 pages and sent them to Sandra before her horchata was finished. The second site opened in March. A school on the east side of the borough, the one the counselor had been calling Daniel about for 4 months. The first session had 18 kids. By the 4th week, it had 26. The school counselor, a woman in her 50s named Dr. Anita Reyes, who had been doing this work long enough to know the difference between a program that would last and one that wouldn't, told Daniel at the end of the first month that she hadn't seen kids engage with something this fast since she'd been at the school. "What are you doing differently?" she asked. "We're not asking them to leave anything at the door," he said. She looked at him. "Every language program I've seen," she said slowly, "tells kids to focus on English. Put the other stuff aside. Build the bridge from one side only." "Bridges built from one side fall in the middle," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Can I steal that?" she said. "It's not mine," he said. It belongs to a 9-year-old. Emma, for her part, treated the expansion of Words Are Bridges with the proprietary pride of a founder. She asked for weekly updates. She had opinions about the second site's flashcard selection that she delivered to Yolanda with the directness of someone who had been raised not to confuse politeness with honesty. Yolanda received these opinions with complete seriousness, which was exactly the right move because Emma could tell immediately when an adult was humoring her and responded to it with the specific cold politeness of someone who has decided you are no longer worth her full attention. Daniel watched all of this and said nothing, and felt in the quiet, specific way that things felt when they were right, that something he had started alone in a borrowed room with 6 kids and a folding table was now larger than he could manage by himself, and that this was exactly what it was supposed to be. What he had not prepared for was what happened in April. It started with a journalist. Not the one Vivian had handled in November, a different one from a different publication. Someone who had been following the story of the second site opening through the school's community newsletter and had done enough digging to connect the dots between Words or Bridges. Vivian Moreau's foundation and a mechanic on the west side of Manhattan who had been running a Saturday language program for immigrant kids for 3 years on $40 a week. She called Daniel directly. He almost didn't pick up. He didn't recognize the number, and he'd learned to be careful with numbers he didn't recognize since November. But something made him answer, and the journalist, her name was Christine, and she had the particular quality of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that the way you asked a question determined whether you got the truth. Said Mr. Hayes, "I'm not looking for the Billionaire does charity angle. I'm looking for the real story, which I think is you." He was quiet. "I've talked to Dr. Reyes at the East Side School," Christine said. "I've talked to Rosa. I've talked briefly to Yolanda Park, who told me to call you and let you decide." A pause. "I've also talked to a waiter named Lucas Bennett who works at a restaurant called Ardoise, and who told me that about 5 months ago, a man in an old blazer stood up in the middle of a full dinner service and did something he said he'd never forgotten." Daniel sat with this for a long moment. "What did Lucas say I did?" he said. "He said you treated him like a person when someone with a lot more power in the room had just finished treating him like furniture," Christine said. "And then he said you spoke 5 languages in 60 seconds, and the whole room went quiet." Another pause. "He said it was the most remarkable thing he'd ever seen in 4 years of waiting tables, and that he'd changed how he thought about his job after that night." Daniel said nothing. "I'm not trying to make you famous," Christine said. "I'm trying to write about what it actually looks like when someone uses what they know to help people instead of to separate themselves from people. Because I don't see that story told often enough." He thought about Emma's showcase. He thought about Kevin's word for the weight of a debt you owe someone who will never ask you to repay it. He thought about 32 handprints on a banner, and then 58 handprints because the second site had added their own. He thought about what Vivian had said in November. "I don't want it to be just words. The families are private," he said. "I won't name or photograph any child or family without written consent." Christine said immediately, "I've already discussed this with Yolanda. The program stays in control of its own narrative." "Agreed. And I want to read the piece before it publishes. That's not usually how we—" She stopped. "Yes," she said. "All right." He called Vivian. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been expecting the call. He explained what Christine had said. Vivian was quiet through the whole thing. When he finished, she said, "What do you want to do?" "I don't know yet," he said. "What do you think?" She was quiet for a moment, and he knew she was thinking, not performing. Thinking, not assembling a PR calculation, actually thinking. He'd learned the difference over the last 4 months. "I think," she said carefully, "that the reason you didn't post about this program for 3 years was because you were protecting it. Keeping it contained so it could grow without interference." A pause. "But I also think that what you built is something more people should be able to find. There are kids at schools all over the city whose counselors don't know Words Are Bridges exists." He hadn't thought about it that way. "The story doesn't change what the program is," Vivian continued. "It just changes who can reach it." He sat with that. "You've gotten good at this," he said. "At what?" at saying the true thing instead of the useful thing. She was quiet for a beat. "I had a good teacher," she said. He called Christine back. He said yes. The piece ran 6 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in mid-May. It was long, the kind of long that publications didn't usually run anymore, the kind that required you to commit to something. Christine had titled it "The Bridges We Build," and she had done what she said she would do, which was tell the real story. She told it from Lucas's perspective first. The restaurant, the wrong bottle, the public humiliation, and then a man in a worn blazer standing up from his table without fanfare and handling it in French like someone who had been handling things for a long time. She quoted Lucas directly, "I've thought about that night probably once a week since it happened. Not because of the languages, because of the fact that he didn't have to get up. He had nothing to gain. He just saw something wrong, and he got up." Then she pulled back. She told Daniel's story the way it actually was. The international coordination work, the 9 countries, the languages learned not from classes, but from need, the wife, the call from Turkey, the plane, the repair shop. The Saturday program started with 6 kids and a folding table. She told it without making him a saint, and without making it simple. And Daniel, reading it the night before it went live, thought it was the most accurate thing anyone had ever written about his life. There was one paragraph near the end that stopped him. Christine had written, "Hayes has never described what he does as sacrifice." When I asked him whether leaving international work to come home felt like giving something up, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The word sacrifice implies you're losing something. I traded one kind of useful for another, the useful that my daughter needed." He paused. "I don't think that's sacrifice. I think that's just knowing what matters." He read that paragraph 3 times. He didn't remember saying it quite that way, but it sounded like something he believed. Emma read the piece on his phone on Thursday morning at the kitchen counter, reading slowly, in the way she read things she was taking seriously. He watched her face. She got through most of it without reacting. Near the end, when she got to the part about Turkey and the call and the plane, she went very still. She knew the broad outline of what had happened. She had been 5, and children absorb things imprecisely at 5, but she knew the shape. She had just never seen it written down by someone outside the family, laid out in plain language on a screen, which was a different experience than knowing. She put the phone down. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Dad," she said. "Yeah?" "You left in 6 hours." "Yeah." "From Turkey." "That's where I was." She looked at the phone, then back at him. "I didn't know that part, the 6 hours." "It's not the part that matters," he said. "It kind of is," she said. He sat down at the counter across from her. He looked at her 10 years old now, since her birthday in December. Double digits, which she had announced with enormous satisfaction, as if she'd been waiting for some kind of upgrade that came with the number. She was growing fast, getting angular, losing the last of the soft roundness of early childhood. She was becoming the person she was going to be, and the person she was going to be was someone Daniel was looking forward to knowing. "The part that matters," he said, "is that I got there." She nodded slowly. "And you stayed," she said. "And I stayed." She picked up his phone and looked at the piece again. She scrolled to the photo Christine had included, the only photo in the piece taken with consent, at the end of one of the Saturday sessions. It was Daniel at his vocabulary table, with his back to the camera, bent slightly toward a child Daniel recognized as Amara. Amara was looking up at him, with an expression that Christine had described in her caption as the look of someone finding a word they needed. Emma stared at the photo for a long time. Then she said, "Can I have a copy of this? Like printed?" "Yeah," he said. "We can do that." She handed his phone back. She got off the bar stool. She picked up her backpack from the floor. At the door, she stopped and turned back. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "I think you should call Vivian." "Why?" "Because she's going to read this and feel things, and I think she might not know what to do with them." Emma said this with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had been paying close attention to Vivian Moreau for 4 months. "And you're better at that than she is." She left for school. Daniel sat in the kitchen and looked at the empty bar stool and thought about being advised on emotional support by a 10-year-old, and thought that Emma was almost certainly right, as she frequently was, which was at once his greatest achievement and his most humbling daily reality. He called Vivian. She answered immediately. "I read it," she said. "I know. The 6 hours from Turkey." Her voice was different than usual. Not broken. Vivian didn't do broken, but stripped of the professional layer, the slight formality that was always there, even when they were being direct with each other. "You never mentioned that detail." "It's not a detail I lead with." "Daniel." She stopped. He waited. "I almost didn't call you in November," she said. "After the restaurant. I sat in my car for 11 minutes before I went up to my apartment, and I almost convinced myself that the apology wasn't necessary, that it was disproportionate, that what happened in the restaurant was minor and the social cost of acknowledging it was too high." A pause. "I almost made that choice." "But you didn't," he said. "No, but I almost did." He could hear her breathing. "And if I had, I would have stayed exactly who I was. And you would have stayed exactly who you were. And Emma would never have taken my hand on that sidewalk." Her voice was steady, but only barely. "And I wouldn't know what any of this felt like." He was quiet. "I don't know how to say what I want to say," she said, and this he knew was the most vulnerable thing Vivian Moreau had ever said in a professional context, because she always knew what to say. That was one of her fundamental operating principles. She always had the words. "You don't have to say it," he said. "I know what it is." A long pause. "Okay," she said. "Emma says you're going to feel things today and not know what to do with them." A short silence. Then, she said that, "This morning, before school." Another silence. Then quietly, "She's terrifying." "She really is," he said. He heard something shift in Vivian's voice, not quite a laugh, not quite a cry, somewhere in the register between the two that lived in the chest rather than the throat. "I'm going to come to the session on Saturday." "You come every Saturday." "I know. I wanted to say it." A pause. "I'll bring the flashcards." "Kevin's going to judge your progress." "Kevin judges everyone's progress," she said. "It's his best quality." He almost said, "See you Saturday," and ended the call. But Emma's voice was in his head. She's going to feel things and not know what to do with them. And he thought about the 11 minutes Vivian had sat in a car before deciding to make a phone call that changed both their lives, and he thought about what it cost a person to choose differently than they'd always chosen repeatedly week after week in a room that didn't know her name. "Hey," he said. "Yeah. You're doing the right thing." She was quiet. "I know that's not what you usually hear," he said, "from anyone. Because the people around you are usually telling you what you're accomplishing or what you should do next, or what the strategic implication is." He paused. "But I'm telling you the other thing. You're doing the right thing. And it matters." The silence on her end lasted long enough that he thought the call might have dropped. Then she said, "Thank you." 2 words. Said the way she'd said, "You're welcome back in November," not as a social reflex, but as a real thing, a thing with weight in it. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she said. The piece ran everywhere by that afternoon. Not everywhere in the way of viral disasters. Everywhere in the slower, more durable way of something that people sent to each other because it made them feel something they wanted someone else to feel too. By evening, it had been shared 30,000 times. By the next morning, it was at 90,000. By the end of the week, Christine's inbox had more than 400 messages from school counselors, language program coordinators, community center directors, and parents asking how to find words or bridges, how to replicate it, how to start something similar in their own city. Daniel's phone rang for 3 days straight. He let most of it go to voicemail. He called back the school counselors first, then the community center directors. Then carefully, a woman in Chicago who ran a similar program with none of the resources and all of the same instincts, and whose voice on the phone had the particular quality of someone who had been working alone in a good direction for a long time and was very tired. He talked to her for 40 minutes. At the end of the call, she said, "How did you keep going before you had support?" He thought about it. "I didn't think about keeping going," he said. "I just did the next Saturday, and then the one after that." "That's it." "That's it." She was quiet. "Okay," she said. "I can do the next Saturday." He called Vivian that night and told her about the Chicago woman and the 40 minutes and what she'd said at the end. Vivian was quiet through all of it. Then she said, "I want to fund her program." "I know you do." "Is that too fast?" "No," he said. "Call her tomorrow. Tell her the same things you told me, all 3 conditions." "What if she has her own conditions?" "Then you listen to them," he said, "and you honor them." A pause. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple," he said. "It's not easy, but it's simple." She called the Chicago woman the next morning. The call lasted an hour. When Vivian called Daniel afterward, she was quieter than usual, which was how he'd learned to identify when something had moved her. "She cried," Vivian said, "when I told her about the funding. She apologized for crying, and I told her not to." A pause. "I almost cried." "Did you?" "I'm not going to confirm or deny that." "Vivian, I'm not?" But her voice had the shape of something that was almost a smile. "Daniel, she's been running her program for 4 years, alone. She's been buying supplies out of her own salary the same way you were. She said nobody had ever called to ask what she needed." He thought about what that meant. 4 years. Alone. Nobody calling. He thought about how many rooms like that existed. How many people buying supplies out of their own salaries doing the next Saturday, and then the one after that, because they understood something about what was possible if you just kept doing it. "There are more of them," he said. "I know," she said. "We have to find them." "I know that too," she said. "I already asked Sandra to start looking." He was quiet. "This is going to get bigger than we planned," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." "Are you okay with that?" A pause, not a short one. "I'm okay with that," she said. "As long as the conditions stay the same." "They stay the same," he said. "No matter how big it gets. The families stay private. The programs stay in control, and the people running it stay visible." He paused. "The money is invisible. The people are not." "Agreed," she said. "Completely." 6 months after the piece ran, Words Are Bridges had operating programs in 7 cities. Chicago was the second. Detroit was the third. A small program in Houston that a retired teacher named Octavia had been running out of her church fellowship hall for 2 years became the fourth when Yolanda called her on a Tuesday afternoon and heard in the first 30 seconds of the conversation the exact same quality she'd heard in Daniel's voice the first time they'd met. The voice of someone who had been doing the right thing for a long time without asking whether anyone was going to show up to help. Octavia showed up the following Saturday. Not to the New York site. She drove 11 hours because she said she needed to see it with her own eyes before she trusted it, which was exactly the kind of judgment Daniel respected and said so. She walked through the room. She watched the vocabulary stations. She watched the way the volunteers moved, the way the kids held the flashcards, the way Daniel crouched down to a child's level when he was talking instead of bending over from above. At the end of the session, she sat down across from him at the empty vocabulary table. "You built something real," she said. "We built something real," he said. "Took more people than me." "But you started it." "I started it with 6 kids and a folding table," he said. "The rest of it showed up because the first thing was true." She looked at him for a long moment. "The first thing was true," she repeated. "That's the whole secret, isn't it?" "That's the whole secret," he said. Emma across the room helping Amara organize the storage shelf looked up at that moment and caught her father's eye. She made a small gesture, both thumbs up, the absolute unself-conscious enthusiasm of someone who had no professional reputation to protect, and then went back to organizing. Daniel looked at his daughter. He thought about a 9-year-old who had asked for one fancy dinner and gotten something neither of them had expected. He thought about a Saturday program that had started as a small private act of believing that every child deserved to feel like their language was a bridge and not a burden. He thought about an apology made from a car, and a handshake at a folding table, and a banner with crooked bridges, and the weight of a debt you owed someone who would never ask you to repay it. He thought about all the rooms in all the cities where someone was doing the next Saturday right now, buying their own supplies, making their own sign, teaching their own 32 kids that the words they carried from home were not something to leave at the door. He thought about the fact that none of it, not the restaurant, not the 5 languages, not the piece in the magazine, not the 7 cities had started because he was trying to prove something or change something or build something. It had started because a young man was standing alone in the middle of a room full of people who were all looking elsewhere, and Daniel Hayes had put his fork down. That was the whole story. A man who put his fork down, and everything that was possible when someone did. Octavia was still looking at him. "So," she said, "what's next?" He looked at his daughter across the room. He looked at Yolanda, who was on her phone already working. He looked at the banner on the bulletin board, the handprints in yellow and red and green and blue, the crooked bridges that had somehow held everything they were asked to hold. He picked up a flashcard from the table. He turned it over. He put it back down. "The next Saturday," he said. And that was enough. That had always been enough. And in a world that rewarded the loudest voice and the highest floor, and the most impressive thing you could order, a quiet man in an old blazer had proved, without trying to prove anything, that the most powerful thing you could possess was not a title, or a portfolio, or 4 languages spoken at a dinner table, to remind a room of its order. It was the willingness to get up. To get up when no one expected it, when nothing required it, when the room was full of people choosing not to. To get up and cross the distance between yourself and someone who needed you to. That was the bridge. That had always been the bridge. And Daniel Hayes, father mechanic, former field coordinator, Saturday morning vocabulary teacher man, in an old blazer, built it 1 word at a time in 5 languages, on a foundation of something so simple that most people spent their whole lives overcomplicating it. He treated every person like their story was worth knowing. And it turned out that was the only credential that ever really mattered.